Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the second of three fall lectures of the 2024 Society of Architectural Historians, St. Louis Chapter, St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library Lecture Series. On behalf of the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, we are pleased to continue our collaboration with the Society of Architectural Historians, St. Louis Chapter, and host this lecture series. Should you have any questions, please type them into the comment section. After our talk tonight, we will pose your questions to tonight's speaker, Michael Allen. And now I'd like to introduce John C. Gunther, FAIA Lead AP, an architect who serves as president of the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter. He will introduce our speaker for this evening's talk.
Thank you, Trent, for your welcome and for hosting this talk. Please know how appreciative we are to the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, for our continued collaboration for our Architecture Around the World lecture series. It is my privilege to introduce our friend and colleague and tonight's speaker. Michael R. Allen works as an academic researcher, historian, teacher, design critic, public artist, critical spatial tour guide, and heritage conservationist. The binding ties in his research are investigation of the construction, maintenance, conservation, and contestation of architectural and infrastructural space as politically symbolic space, studying of the claiming of material heritage, and the politics of its conservation, curiosity about the project of modernity as a spatial reordering, and inquiry into the forms of liberatory agency that realize the potential of the modern metropolis to distribute wealth, knowledge, and shelter. Since July 2024, Allen is a visiting assistant professor of history at West Virginia University, where he leads pedagogy around the built environment for the department's growing public history track. He recently served as the inaugural executive director of the National Building Arts Center, an anti-museum of the American built environment, rooted in the largest collection of architectural artifacts in the U.S., as well as comprehensive research library on the U.S. built environment. From 2016 through 2024, Allen was senior lecturer in architecture, landscape architecture, and urban design at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts. And from 2014 through 2024, lecturer in American Culture Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Allen's university teaching has focused on interdisciplinary investigation of architectural history, cultural dimensions of landscape, historic preservation, political power, and urban space, and the racial histories of U.S. cities. Allen was director of the Preservation Research Office, a heritage consultancy that he founded from 2009 through 2022. He is a U.S. federally qualified architectural historian who has worked on various historic preservation projects in 14 U.S. states. Allen co-founded the international interdisciplinary project Housing Blocks, Ordinary Modernism Across the Atlantic with Ladna Butnik-Prika. The project received support from the Divided City and Urban Humanities Initiative funded by the Mellon Foundation. Allen's scholarly and critical articles have appeared in a wide range of scholarly and popular sources, such as Buildings and Landscapes, City Lab, Designo, 45 Journal, Hyperallergic, Next City, Platform, Temporary Art Review, St. Louis American, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and Studies in the History of Gardens and Designed Landscapes. He has contributed chapters to Bending the Future, 50 Ideas About the Next 50 Years of Historic Preservation, Midwest Architecture Journeys, and Buildings of Missouri. In 2018, the National Trust for Historic Preservation named him to its 40 Under 40 list, honoring young preservationists whose work is expanding the concept and practice of historic preservation in the United States. From 2021 to 2024, Allen served on the Preservation Board of the City of St. Louis. Allen holds a PhD in Cultural Heritage from the University of Birmingham, United Kingdom, where his dissertation thesis was entitled Dissident Modernism, Mass Housing as Architectural Heritage in the U.S. Tonight, Michael will talk about a new museum of the built environment for our age, the National Building Arts Center. This lecture will explore the genesis of the National Building Arts Center, the relatively new museum of the American building arts developed by Larry Giles from his renowned artifact collection. From its inception of Giles collecting against the backdrop of the urban renewal era and the rise of historic preservation to the current effort to develop a visitor center at the center's historic steel foundry campus. All points of the development of the project will be presented. Fundamentally, this lecture will present why a new museum and research center is needed today, and why the unique artifact and archival collections of the center make it a logical national hub for research and publication. And now, please welcome Michael Allen as he presents a new museum of the built environment for our age, the National Building Arts Center.
Good evening, friends in St. Louis and everywhere else. As John noted, my name is Michael Allen. I'm currently here in Morgantown, West Virginia, where I'm serving as visiting assistant professor in the history department at West Virginia University. Until a few months ago, however, I was in St. Louis, where I was engaged as the first professional executive director at the National Building Arts Center. So I'd like to thank the Society of Architectural Historians chapter for inviting me to follow up to Bob Moore's riveting lecture about the idea of creating an architecture museum in St. Louis. And I'm here with some good news. It's here now and it exists, and it's called the National Building Arts Center. Perhaps you've already been. Let's take a look. So the title of my talk frames this as a new museum of the built environment for our age. What do all these things mean? Well, we will unpack that. What does it mean to create a new museum? Is it different than others? What is the comprehensive nature of the phrase built environment versus architecture mean in this setting? And what do we mean by our age? Is that today? Is that when this project started? When exactly did this project start? Well, there are many answers ahead for all of this. And those of you in the SAH chapter maybe have been fortunate enough to have already attended a meeting or event at the NBAC. Here are some of you gathered last year for the annual meeting. I see Rick Rosen, Karen Bodie Baxter, John Gunther, Peter Wallenberg, Leslie Hamilton, maybe a few others. I'm in this picture too. So that you can see from here, when we think of the phrase new museum, maybe it's not that hard. Here we are sitting in a partially enclosed, partially renovated steel casting shed at a steel foundry. And it looks like a lot of work has been done, like this concrete floor built almost personally by Larry Giles, the founder of the museum. But a lot remains, stacks of crates and various forms of equipment in the midst. And of course, no windows, doors, or climate control. That's not very museum-like, is it? Well, don't be fooled. That event in that space shows that we indeed are dealing with a museum in the making, a museum who already has accomplished quite a bit. Let's take a look at the National Building Arts Center's mission statement for a second here. The mission statement currently is that the NBAC will end up becoming a leading institution facilitating public understanding and conservation of the built environment and its material, design, and social dimensions through the development of a museum and study center, as well as with public outreach and programming. What does all that entail? Well, there are three major program areas of the NBAC, and all of them are up and running. If you remember, for years, this project is one of those projects that was rumored to exist or rumored to be about to exist. Now it actually exists, and you can set foot in its spaces and its programs with a lot more regularity than you could when this was just an idea. So we have artifact collections. This is the largest collection of built environment artifacts in the United States, Built environment meaning more than just architecture, includes engineering and manufacturing. This doesn't just come from St. Louis, though. We have about 2/3 to 70% of the collection, as far as we know, coming from St. Louis. A lot of it salvaged by Larry Giles directly, but also artifacts from Chicago, Philadelphia, and other American cities that round out this collection inside of the artifacts and in the archives. There's an archive and library. Some of you may not know this. This is an expansive and majestic space rivaling some of the peer institutions like the Avery Library at Columbia University. In fact, our library goes further with trade catalogs, um, geology studies, patents, and other aspects that are crucial to understanding the built environment. This is open to the public now, Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 5. Curating and educating. Well, maybe you did see our exhibition at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation last year. That was quite a big moment for the NBAC. Or maybe you've set foot at the campus to attend a lecture or go to our art gallery. We have a tenant art gallery, non-standard. Maybe you've been on one of the monthly tours, second Saturday of each month at 11 a.m. like clockwork. All of this is happening again, even though the capacity of the institution still stands to grow. What are we talking about, though, in terms of where this is? It's sort of an interesting horseshoe from Bob's talk in September, because Charles Peterson's vision for an architecture museum in the view of the Gateway Arch does exist. However, that view is looking back through the industrial process vessels of what I call the SAH skyline. SAH, this industrial suburb just south of East St. Louis, a very, very close distance to downtown St. Louis, closer to downtown St. Louis than the Central West End. And this is where the NBAC occupies the historic Sterling Steel Casting Company site, which was built in 1921, closed in 2001. This is a site of manufacturing and production that is one of the rare historic preservation projects involving a gray iron steel foundry in the United States. I'm out here now in the Allegheny Rust Belt, so I'm very familiar with what's happening in Pittsburgh and sites around that area. And many of these kinds of facilities are demolished, just as they are in St. Louis. So the decision to put the collection here in this space creates a second project, preserving the foundry, as well as this important context. The power of this collection to reveal how things are made is amplified by being in a space not only of past making, but present making, even if we are a little suspicious of what is being made sometimes, given the emissions coming from industrial neighbors. But here it is. This is a site that holds the largest collection. You can see it right, the guide showing the scale of this 13.5 acre site. And it left another view showing the presence of the historic buildings and the massive amounts of artifacts inside and outside on this site. It's a pretty exciting space. But again, a lot of capital work needs to be done, although a lot has been completed. This view kind of gives you a little diptych of the site. Some of the artifacts are in open storage, quite accessible, like these common Winkle terracotta pieces on the left side on the easel. Those are out on display. Of course, they're unlabeled. Museums typically would label these, or would they? We'll get to that in a little later too. At right, the library looks the most museum-like. Look at these stacks. And there's preservation architect Gunny Harbaugh reaching for a volume on sheet metal. This could be anywhere. This could be in the stacks of the Met or the St. Louis Art Museum. That part of the museum is surprisingly finished and in operation. Take another look. The old shower room of the last office building built on the site in 1951 now serves as the library main stacks, packed to the brims with information on the built environment, ranging from architecture and landscape architecture through the different material arts, ceramics, metals, stone, and all of the processes of extraction, finance, geologic identification, and architectural design needed to make the built environment a system. I think this room shows you what the NBAC is all about. It is about understanding the built environment as a living system, one that has historic roots, but one whose evolution is not yet over. And the library collections are not stopped by any temporal bounds. They cover everything from the ancient world to contemporary production. So, more on the NBAC than up front here. What do we have? The largest collection of architectural artifacts, with some peer institutions out there, maybe, that have other collections, like the Brooklyn Museum. More on that again in a second. Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, Richard Nichols collection. We'll talk about that. The vastness of the collecting is quite unparalleled and distinguishes us from potential peers. In terms of the collection, though, only 1 to 2% has been cataloged starting in just 2022. Most of what was here over the years was stored in Larry Giles' deep, vast memory. Myself and the archives and collections manager at the site today, Emery Cox, know quite a bit, not as much as Larry ever would have known. And other volunteers and scholars are starting to learn the ways here as well, but a lot of professional cataloging remains to be completed. There's a professional staff since 2021 when Emery started as archives and collections manager. I joined in 2022 as a part-time executive director. I served until this summer at the end of July. It was still part-time. It's probably one of the reasons why I'm here in West Virginia in a full-time research professorship. But the organization's working on finding a replacement while the board president, Mike Jackson, serves as an interim director. I was in the right space at the right time to take that role on, and that's a hat trick that doesn't necessarily repeat twice. Now the goal is to raise the money to bring in a professional executive director for a multi-year engagement. There's a board of 8 people, a modest annual budget of around 200,000, although that's much bigger than a lot of people would think and much bigger than where the organization was when I first got involved. And of course, we have the monthly tours and special events. So this is a young museum, as I like to say. This is the prologue still. Or maybe there's a long set of introductions before you get to chapter 1. Chapter 1, when does that start? Well, I think we're not quite even there yet. The real power of this institution has not been fully unleashed. But let's take a look at some peer institutions or similar institutions to think about what the NBAC does that other organizations and institutions don't do. And think about what it could do to draw in more visitors. Of course, an obvious parallel is the City Museum. We don't have enough time in this lecture to talk about the relationship between Larry Giles and Bob Casserly that began as a friendship and mentorship and ended as a somewhat frenemy situation. Their differences were personal as well as philosophical. And Eric Sandweiss, the historian who serves as the vice president of the board at National Building Arts Center, has written a great chapter on the kind of contrast, the dialectic here. In his version, Casserly is Dionysus mirthfully playing with the artifacts, while Larry Giles is the majestic and almost saintly Apollo, seeking perfection in his taxonomic and scholarly approach. And to some extent, that's true, although City Museum has its moments of scholarly and scholarly historic information, such as the Architecture Hall. And NBAC, with its art gallery and other activities lately, like a night tour for Halloween, is showing a playful side that potentially might bring these two organizations into a little more of a symbiosis. But even if they're still going to be at their core different institutions, they are mutually reinforcing. We need both of them. They signpost to each other. And most people are interested in both. And since Bob Casserly's tragic death in 2011 and the loss of Larry Giles 10 years after, these two institutions have been able to rebuild any sort of relationship that was wounded by the founders' conflict. The American Sign Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's also very young, started just in 1999, but exclusively focused on neon and outdoor signage. We try not to replicate this approach, although we do have neon signs at the National Building Arts Center. This is a peer institution of great renown and great accomplishment. We would love to see that foundry shed we showed you look something like this instead of all the neon signs. Rebuilding some of the facades or parts of facades in our collections. We, of course, have the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., in the old pension building. This is a federally funded institution that relies on curatorial efforts circulating around temporary and traveling exhibits. The National Building Museum only collects small collections. They do have some interesting collections on site, but they are not set up to be a vast repository like the NBAC. We foresee maybe someday a moment when you'll be able to visit the National Building Museum and see an exhibition curated out of National Building Arts Center artifacts. And here again, the building also is a great guide to the built environment. While our industrial basilica reveals the world of riveted steel frame construction. Here we have the ways in which plaster conceals brick. All of this is a brick construction, including those columns clad in plaster made to look like marble through the Scagliola approach. Their building also reveals the building arts and their complexities. We have some other examples too in Illinois. Up the river, Quincy, Illinois' Gardner Museum recently renamed as the History Museum on the Square. It's more focused on local history than it used to be, but it still retains its core collections of architectural artifacts reassembled both outdoors and indoors. And of course, the SIUE Museum is a great friend of ours. There's a history between Larry's efforts and their efforts. They're the recipient of Richard Nichols' large collection, although, as Bob showed us, they also have some objects from the Gateway Arch site. Much like us, though, they're a museum stuck without much of a facility. Maybe we're even more blessed to have open spaces to hold lectures and events. SIUE Museum does have the distinction versus us, though, of having climate control, and so they are an indoor storage facility where items can be accessed and studied. And there are some displays that have come out of their architectural collections, the largest of which is at the Lovejoy Library on the campus in Edwardsville. And in that exhibition, you can see some of the Louis Sullivan artifacts. There's also the Historic Preservation Conservation Labs and Materials collections at Columbia University. These support the oldest historic preservation master's program in the country, founded in 1964. All of these artifacts, though, are for teaching purposes, to teach material composition and conservation work. They're recently begun a process of determining whether or not they should be deaccessioning some of these objects or thinking about other forms of public use. They don't want these objects to sit around and collect dust. They are not in the business of storing large amounts of materials long term. One of Larry Giles' dreams with the National Building Arts Center was to support trades education around building trades in the historic building arts. Well, in 2004, the American College of Building Arts opened in Charleston, South Carolina. This sort of answers that call, and the two institutions have a reciprocity so far on library items, sending publications that are duplicated back and forth so that we can each benefit from our strange pursuits. Whether or not NBAC ever develops these kinds of programs may depend on what happens with future collaboration with the American College. We would like to see efforts in tandem. This is a place here where there's a 4-year degree program. That's not something NBAC would ever probably be set up to do. So they found a unique niche and also located in a very interesting industrial foundry building. Should point out that here in West Virginia, near West Virginia University, Arthur Dale Heritage and a New Deal housing settlement is working on creating a public preservation trade school for ordinary people to learn skills. So somewhat of a revival these days. So if NBAC is none of those things, what does it do? Well, it holds the memories of the building trades, the built environment, and society. It looks for artifacts that have multifaceted ways of appreciation, and it collects things that other institutions wouldn't collect, such as single fragments, like what happened here at the Culver House, recently demolished for the expansion of the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra. This is a very ornate home, and in the end, NBAC was able to get just one piece. Now, other pieces were salvaged by the nonprofit Refab for resale, so the building materials were diverted from the waste stream. But this is a sandstone address plaque hand carved. It serves as a physical reminder of this building and its great architecture, but it fills a gap in our collection around sandstone, a very common building material, especially in the Romanesque and late Victorian architectural styles like this house. And so there's lots of things to appreciate with having just this single piece. You can see with the delamination and discoloration, it also needs conservation work. So for future teaching and instruction, it could come in handy. We have more of the James Clemens Jr. house. This is a very interesting antebellum mansion with a sort of complex history set on the north side of St. Louis on the wrong side of the redlining that has really decimated the majority African American section of the city. This house was put under the ownership or bought, sorry, by Northside Regeneration, a speculative redevelopment scheme that let the building burn. And in 2017, the building wooden components were reduced to ash. By then, the portico or loggia on the front of the building had already reached the National Building Arts Center when it was pulling away, and Northside Regeneration had it removed. The other ironwork was removed by another team of collectors and is currently potentially going to end up in the National Building Arts Center so that you could literally recompose the entire front elevation of this house. Now, just to think about why this is important, obviously we have this Palladian villa architecture here imported to St. Louis. That's not the only house in that style, but it's the only one whose every ornamental detail was made of cast iron. This could be the largest installation of cast iron in a residential building in U.S. history. At least that was the opinion of Charles Peterson, whose studies of the eastern cities would probably make that a definitive statement. The Clemens House has a problematic past, though. Its builder was a noted white supremacist and enslaver. While he contributed to Western expansion, he even owned the old Rock House for a while to tie these talks together even further. Leading up to the Civil War, he was concerned for the potential of abolition and resisted that during the Civil War. He was a staunch Confederate supporter, and after the Civil War, refused to sign a loyalty oath. At first, eventually, he did capitulate to the Union. But James Clemens Jr. Had enslaved people on this property. They may have built this property or assisted in its construction, not in the foundry work that made these columns, but potentially making and laying the bricks. So this could be a site of tortured memory. At the NBAC, all of these aspects are simultaneously of interest. And this is again why we think the physical artifact is important. It is a reminder, a visual reminder of the complexity of our past. And in the case of something like the Clemens House, it's much harder to speculate and imagine it as a vacant lot than it is as a set of columns. A set of columns at least can be animated, staged, seen, compared to photographs. That gives something legibility. And we'll talk a little more about the Clemens House in a second. So when Larry Giles is returning to St. Louis, though, in the 1970s, it's a different city than the one he left before he volunteered to serve in the Vietnam War in the 1960s. I should note he went to high school in California in the LA area first, so he'd been gone for a little while, but had fond memories of strolling the streets and looking at the great architecture with his grandfather and other relatives. In 1973, though, he landed back in the city after his third tour of duty in the Vietnam War led to a near-death experience in a troop carrier crash. he wasn't the young patriot anymore, but a battle-tested veteran with a dedication to radical politics, especially the anti-war movement, but also a sort of need to reignite his relationship to the United States. He had seen what he had thought was the biggest sham the U.S. had perpetrated in the Vietnam War, but coming back to the demolition-ravaged worlds of urban renewal St. Louis, he had found what he thought maybe was an even bigger sham, the destruction of every bit of American architecture that held the memories and histories of a nation that claimed to revere its own past. And here in the Mill Creek Valley, this is the site of the soccer stadium, demolition was in full swing and had already really come through when this neighborhood was demolished, 454-acre African American neighborhood that you can see in the photograph here at the right in the top left. 20,000 people and 839 small businesses had to be relocated from the Mill Creek Valley. That's an image showing an aerial view of St. Louis, everything that's been demolished between 1940 and 1970 for urban renewal. Freeways, the Gateway Arch, the bottom left, Pruitt-Igoe is a kind of island floating around the center right. A lot of destruction in the name of remaking the city and trying to stabilize its population. Instead, a vortex of destruction and continued rapid population loss as you see it left from 1970 to 1980, the biggest decline of any decade in St. Louis. All those people leaving needed fewer buildings. All those people leaving left people behind who needed a smaller city and fewer buildings. St. Louis seemed to be in free fall and continues to this day, although nothing like what Larry would have encountered in the 1970s when it wasn't just one great building coming down every day in the city, but potentially dozens, maybe hundreds, especially on the north side and the near south side. And this just seemed unconscionable to young Larry Giles. And he was committed to do something that flew in the face of the civic mythology that demolition and reconstruction was going to be the answer to reverse these trends. In fact, they did not. The city today has a population smaller than it did in 1870, fewer than 300,000 residents. So maybe Larry's way actually has produced a little more change. So let's get back to the question of what do we mean by our age? What is our age? When Larry Giles came back in 1973, he faced some of the dynamics that we see in this slide. And I wonder if these are dynamics that we see today. Across 41 years, what really has changed? He encountered destruction of urban architecture, especially pre-modernist and vernacular buildings. That's still happening. As North St. Louis is sort of willfully ignored, it is becoming a very empty place. Not with the same rate of demolition, but certainly the same spirit of civic neglect. And the city has just announced its plan to demolish half of the land bank owned real estate as a target, a lot of that historic building stock. The decline in the legacy building trades, that's still something we face, although, as I noted, there's a little bit of an uptick today, greater interest in plasterwork, ironwork, masonry. But still, it's hard to find somebody who can restore a wooden window in St. Louis or many cities. The climate and energy crisis, the early 70s was one of the first periods where people started predicting peak oil usage or peak oil extraction coming. Concern in the architectural field for energy use. That's today blown full steam as we realize we're not just simply in a small crisis, but a prolonged moment of crisis. And to Larry, the built environment was a store of embodied energy, materials made through highly carbonized processes, the kiln firing of brick and terracotta, utilized huge amounts of coal. Why rebuild? Why do this again? Why not save what we have to reduce our carbon footprint through preservation? Redlining and structural racism, we've already touched on that with North St. Louis. That's still continuing. The affordable housing crisis. Today, it's a crisis. In the 1970s, it was just an irritation that there was so little historic affordable housing available. That propelled Larry and other rehabbers to get involved in rehabbing their own houses, buying them cheap and fixing them up. We see that today. corrupt, inept political leadership, the kind that enabled Northside regeneration to come in and demolish and destroy more than it's ever built back. I'm not going to comment much deeply on that, but let's just say the developers still hold the most power through campaign contributions more than public will. Historic preservation movement lacking political power. In the 1990s, Larry told artist Michael Merchant in an interview that the St. Louis preservation movement was toothless. I disagree, but I do think the deck is stacked sometimes in the wrong way. Much of the region lacks preservation planning laws and ordinances. Just the city has the greatest system and the best demolition protections, but even there, Landmarks Association of St. Louis and other preservation actors don't often get taken seriously when it comes to major demolitions associated with powerful developers or major projects like the soccer stadium. Um, their concerns are often quickly brushed aside, despite the fact that there's a lot of public support for those causes. Now, that said, the preservation movement in St. Louis did something beyond tackling entrenched political power, inspiring generations to respect historic neighborhoods and launching a historic tax credit program that stabilized a lot of the neighborhoods Larry thought might fall. The need for DIY skills. Larry had no mentorship or training in salvage. He was a big advocate for everyone having that kind of John Dewey individualistic soul that could be reached and taught no matter who you were. That everybody was an individual capable of a lot more, and that schooling often bound us to one way of looking at ourselves. So Larry, who never finished a college degree, was a big DIY educator and student himself. And this is the world he came back to, a world where expertise and professionalism was seeming to target the beautiful historic environment. And he came to a city whose very target or very icon came at the expense of the 40 oldest blocks of the city. I'm not going to malign the Gateway Arch, and there were efforts, as Bob showed us, to preserve parts of the 40 blocks, or at least certain buildings, or eventually artifacts. But this is a symbol that carries the paradox. It comes at the moment when its historic commemorative features are also the triumph of forces that just want wholesale clearance of the city, and the Arch's 40 blocks are just the first of many sets of historic neighborhoods that are wiped off of the map, so to speak. Now, Larry got into historic preservation as a salvager in 1973, launching a for-profit company called the St. Louis Architectural Art Company. And the scholar and artist Evan Calder Williams reminds us that the roots of the word salvage in English are associated with the recovery of commodity. And so the earliest salvage workers were looking at sunken ships and cargoes that could be recovered. And in St. Louis, that perhaps rings a bell when you think about James Buchanan Eads. His invention of the diving bell was specifically to go into the Mississippi and recover cargo from the sunken steamships. All of this means that salvage has a long association with profit-driven pursuit of valuable commodities that can be resold. But there's another tradition that I think ultimately is the tradition Larry fits more into. We'll talk a little more about his business work, but in the end, I think he unwittingly resurrected this work that the ancient Romans called spolia, or the spoils. This is a practice of recovering valuable parts of historic sites, often that have been damaged, sacked, burned, or destroyed. Sometimes it's a deliberate removal from for various reasons. And it goes all the way back to the 300 AD or so in the Roman Empire. And we see this in certain works in Rome, like the Arch of Janus, the Arch of Constantine, the colonnade of Old St. Peter's Basilica, or, here the Arch of Constantine really shows us the full force of this approach, where the removal of certain panels and plaques and relief panels from other emperors' arches and monuments integrated here into Constantine's arch. So set into the barrel vaults and classical columns. We have panels from Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. All of these coming in to give Constantine's monument the trappings of antiquity, as if he were the only emperor of Rome. But that's not all that's happening. There's definitely a potential to mislead the viewer. But there's something else with salvage that I think is important to think of with the National Building Arts Center. And that is most of the spolia practices saw that these artifacts as having apotropaic properties, that is, protective properties. So bringing your predecessors great tributes onto your monument may protect your reign. And throughout the Roman world and the Islamic world, places like Kairoun, Cordoba, and Gaza, spolia was a very common practice. We see it here in Turkey. It comes through even in the Renaissance era, where this basilica in Trieste, Italy, or Tourist, as the Slovenes call it, incorporates earlier pieces of the church. The smaller church had to be demolished to build a bigger basilica. But here they're bringing forth sacred relics of the previous church for protection, but also in a symbolic display of the long commitment of the Catholic Church to this region. And in St. Louis, of course, we have the Lindell Hotel. There's no no St. Louisan is a stranger to the potential mistaken identification of these stones from a neoclassical building as an old ancient temple. That's deliberate, as Henry Shaw, the English-born hardware merchant who laid out Tower Grove Park with his planners, wanted to have a microcosm of the Grand Tour in the park for ordinary people who could not reach Europe on the Holy Land. Other museums bring forth different displays as well. The Brooklyn Museum and the Archaeological Museum of Thessaloniki here, restaging columns from the 20th century and from antiquity. Here we see in both displays the absent entasis, or the curvature in the center of the column that gives it a more visually delightful form. The Brooklyn Museum is home to one of the more notable installations of American architectural artifacts, and those all come from one of the figures that kind of nests Larry into a world of post-World War II salvagers. Or are they really salvagers? Because the motives are not necessarily profit-driven. So recovery might be the better word. That's the word that Ivan Karp used here. Ivan Karp was artistic agent for Andy Warhol and other artists. He began collecting architectural pieces out of demolition sites as a teenager in the 1940s. He creates the Anonymous Arts Recovery Society with his wealth and goes after decorative terracotta and stone pieces, including sometimes entire elements like a Gothic bay window from a Manhattan townhouse that's now in Sauget at the National Building Arts Center. The Brooklyn Museum really didn't do much with this work. In 2004, when they renovated the museum, they built a new subway station with the MTA and installed some of his artifacts there, but quickly realized they didn't have much will to install much else and began transferring Karp's collection to the National Building Arts Center. But Karp again uses the word recovery, not salvage. Recovery can have a strong visual rhetoric. This Norman McGrath photograph of Penn Station showing the eagle, the symbol of the nation, being carted away, was mistaken by New York Times readers as a sign that this was off to be destroyed. Instead, this eagle was on its way to a new home as a work of salvage, but these photographs compelled the nation to rally behind the 1966 passage of the National Historic Preservation Act, which is another important sort of precedent on Larry entering the world in the 1970s. There's a groundswell preservation and an emerging regulatory framework. Another figure he's compared to is Richard Nickel. Nickel, also a disillusioned military veteran coming out of the Army in the Korean era, begins taking photography classes at the Illinois Institute of Design, which would merge with the Armour Institute to become the Illinois Institute of Technology. Uh, Nickel had great teachers like the photographers Aaron Siskin and Harry Callahan, and was assigned to photograph every one of Louis Sullivan's buildings that were still standing. In his photography, he began the circuit of rephotographing buildings and would notice the buildings under demolition or just gone. And that compelled him to self-train using hardware store tools and rope in the back of his station wagon to remove Sullivan ornament that he would identify and take these documentary photographs to locate the different panels and try to get one of each. Nickel filled his parents' garage and backyard in suburban Chicago as well as part of the Old Navy Pier. Um, his goal was to preserve the artistic genius of Louis Sullivan and a few other Chicago architects. He was not interested in the built environment from a systemic standpoint as much as Larry Giles, um, but in this kind of aesthetic patrimony. Nichols' collection grew so large, and there was no Chicago Institute willing to display it, in part because of its political nature. You might ask, what is the political nature? Well, these are reminders of all of the bad deeds committed by Chicago politicians, especially big buildings like the Chicago Stock Exchange, where Richard Nickel met his own demise in 1972, rescuing a Louis Sullivan designed stair stringer. The building collapsed on him. He became a preservation martyr. So this collection long was a sort of a dark mirror of Chicago destroying itself, much like Giles' collection would become for St. Louis. And so in the 1960s, Nichols' friend Jack Randall worked with Arnold Marmont, one of the trustees at Southern Illinois University, to move this collection to the new Edwardsville campus. The goal was a long-term project to build an architecture museum that would provide cachet to what otherwise was feared to be written off as a commuter school with no serious research agenda. So that became that museum collection. And there's still a museum fulfillment of that dream and vision, much as there was with the Gateway Arch. Jerry Bosco and Ben Milligan in Portland founded the Bosco Milligan Foundation. Eventually, that became the Architectural Heritage Center. Today, their collection of architectural artifacts is in a permanent display and storage in a renovated historic storefront in Portland called the Architectural Heritage Center. But for many years, it just filled their Victorian home and other storage locations. They started in the 1960s. Again, there was no roadmap. All these things were happening simultaneously. Milligan and Bosco, Karp, Nickel, and eventually Larry Giles. But they're still worthy salvagers, maybe, of the old school, the capitalist school out there. And when the Mill Creek Valley demolitions were occurring, there were salvagers and antique dealers who would go into the buildings and rescue pieces and then resell them to the fashionable renovations in Gaslight Square, the St. Louis Entertainment District that is no more, and the Central West End. This fits another national pattern, this resurgence of interest in the so-called handcrafted, although a lot of these were actually industrialized processes that produce these artifacts. But there was a sort of an interest in handcraft that was seen in the renovations and aesthetic predilections of the New York City Greenwich Village and Chicago's Old Town, where it was a mix of antiques and then old-timey music like bluegrass, Dixieland, and folk. So Larry's coming back too into St. Louis, not simply to work on removing pieces of buildings, but also to participate in efforts to conserve and save buildings. He's very passionate about the idea of conservation of entire neighborhoods and sees the salvage work as the last ditch. At first, really sees it as a way to bring those materials back into renovation projects, then realizes that supply and demand are horrendously mismatched. But Larry is one of the founders of the Soulard Restoration Group and puts his money where his mouth is many times over, stabilizing and renovating 24 houses in Soulard, flipping them to different people, but also renovating the historic Stall stables here, probably his signature warehouse where his operations were based from the 1970s to the 2000s. He had to rebuild this facade, restored the fenestration, remilled the windows and carriage doors, and used this for bulk storage. It quickly filled up with cast iron storefronts, as many of you know. He also maintained a showroom on Sydney Street that was much more of a typical antique store. That word can even be applied to anything Larry ever did. Just to look at some of the methods that he was using too. Again, um, a lot of people are surprised by photos like these showing the removal of this terracotta lion and this entire cartouche assembly on the parapet of a building overlooking that you can see in the center, the Pruitt-Igoe site, where Pruitt-Igoe had just been demolished. This is at Cass Avenue in Jefferson. Um, Here they are just using their bare hands, their gloved or looks like some ungloved hands to move this all from behind. And Larry said, removing these objects from behind often um, was the best way, but more often was just the only way available when there wasn't time to set up scaffold because the demolition contractor would get the contract from City Hall or from the owner and be wanting to start the next day. And so Larry would get the call, go out, and be working sometimes above or around the demolition workers. But in the early days, he might not have had a lot of scaffold. Larry, like Nickel, started with small tools that could fit in a bed of a truck and ramped up to an entire fleet of custom-made boom trucks served by an ever-growing network of forklifts and other vessels back at his warehouses. Over at the Webster School Annex in East St. Louis, we see the method here using the handheld pry bars to remove all the masonry perfectly. And again, Larry found the limits of using tools like these, and wasn't long before he was deploying pneumatic airplane or pneumatic aviation drills and hammers outfitted with custom blacksmith chisels to reach into the fine joints of native masonry without chipping or damaging brick or and especially terracotta, which, as you know, is a very delicate hollow clay product, easy to destroy. Many salvagers with the best intentions chip it or break it. But if you walk around the National Building Arts Center, it's notable how few chips there are on the edges of these pieces. And, here's a man who probably working with his crews over the years, and those crews deserve all the credit for being laborers as part of this story as well. Probably hundreds of thousands of pieces of terracotta. I dare anyone to find one chip that wasn't there before the piece was removed. So in the early 80s, Larry's transitioning. He's been at it almost 10 years, and his St. Louis Architectural Art Company has a pipeline for steady but not quite voluminous sales of artifacts. Anything wooden, like doors and mantels, typically sells. People really aren't buying terracotta and cast iron, and he's starting to realize that there's never-ending supplies of important architectural pieces. Still deserve care and retention. So he basically starts subsidizing his collecting with the business rather than the business being the collecting and resale operation. So St. Louis Architectural Art Company becomes sort of a paper front in which the future museum gets its steady stream of cash. But it is a hand-to-mouth operation, aided and abetted strongly by Larry's monthly VA checks. That's how he was able to survive. The Lindell Building came down in 1982, designed by the firm of Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, very significant firm who designed many significant works in St. Louis and Chicago. Larry went after the terracotta bays, but he went after all of them. He harvested almost all the terracotta on this building, bringing back these assemblies for who knows what, even in a museum. Unless you're going to rebuild the Lindell Building, what is the point? Well, to Larry, every piece of this was sacred example of craft, and every piece of terracotta, literally, if you turn it around, has the finger marks of the worker who packed the terracotta into the mold. So it is to him a document of the breadth of the humanity that builds the world we live in. He ramps up further. The Rivoli is one of two major projects in 1983 that I think sets him on the course of making this museum himself. The Rivoli It has a sgraffito facade that's plaster, incised plaster, where they scrape away layers to reveal the color beneath. So here would have been a white layer over that pastel coral color, and it would have been scraped back. It's designed by Charles Ramsey, installed in 1922. The theater's torn down to build a parking lot. Eventually, a building is built there, but Larry goes after every decorative panel, a major undertaking. He's now trying to get the whole building, it seems. And when the Gateway Mall comes blaring through downtown St. Louis, Larry goes after the major terracotta works on the Lincoln Trust building by Eames and Young and the International Buddha building on the same block, all three destroyed by a plan that Mayor Vincent Shamel had campaigned against. When he got elected, he did a 180 and supported tearing down these historic buildings for a so-called completion of the Park Mall system called the Gateway Mall, with an office building on one side and an anemic corporate plaza on the other. Terrible loss for downtown St. Louis. One we're still paying for as north and south downtown are severed from each other. Terrible pedestrian experience to move between those areas. Um, Here Larry went after examples, still a huge scale of salvage, but gets so carried away and raises the money through different sources to rescue all of the winged victory figures on the cornice. Some of those are in the Art Institute of Chicago and the St. Louis Art Museum, among other places. Here's what he's up against still. Um, Mill Creek Valley and that way of thinking about the city as territory to be conquered by brute force, not a nest of handcrafted buildings that hold memories enjoyed by thousands of people, seems to never end. Nor does the countermeasure seem to never be needed. The countermeasure of architectural recovery or salvage, going in and rescuing things. So by 1983, Larry is proclaiming himself an urban archaeologist with an agenda to unleash the meaning found in these artifacts and to go toe to toe with the big political and economic powers that are destroying the information he is hoarding in his warehouses, hoping a new day comes. So Larry's fighting a big intellectual battle on what actually matters in the city, what even makes up the city. To the people in power, it's the economic returns, right? It's not the physical details. To Larry, the physical details are the city. The physical details help us envision who we are and where we've come from. And he's only 35 when he proclaims in this article and several speaking appearances, including a panel at the First Street Forum for Symposium on Artifacts, that there should be a museum of St. Louis's architecture, resurrecting the idea coming from the Gateway Arch. Now, at this point, Larry's made several wealthy friends. He's even sold a storefront to Barbara Streisand. So he thinks maybe some of those people will get together and make the museum happen, and he'll just donate his unwieldy collection. Um, as time goes on, he realizes he's going to have to do all that himself. Larry builds these crates. There are 2,600 of them today at the NBAC, based on a single prototype, meticulously stenciled. They hold all of the delicate pieces of terracotta and stone that he's recovering. His warehouses begin to resemble that scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. And here, some of my students are looking at the crates with more interest than what's on the easels. It's as if looking through plywood, looking through the fog of memory, and conjuring what might be inside. Being Larry Giles, who would have known exactly what was inside, is a role that many people want to play. We all want to even look at the invisible and find meaning. And here, John Ruskin and Bell Hooks offer us some quotes to guide us on this endeavor. Larry looks beyond what covers up in St. Louis. This would be considered an ordinary building, but it's a turn of the century building, clad and reclad, the storefronts modernized, those algonite columns, algonite being a cast stone process, are partially hidden, and very few people are raising complaints when buildings like this are coming down. But Larry's furiously removing those layers to get back and recover these columns, which stood in the backyard of his home in Soulard for many years. Today are over at NBAC, and I hope they rise again. He's going after the process that he describes as learning how the buildings are put together and doing everything in reverse. The St. Louis Title Company, which is today in the City Museum, as the walls of the gift shop, the first floor and second floor joined like this. He is amassing a huge library to learn how a building like this is put together, what the properties of these materials are, so that he doesn't damage or destroy them in the removal. And here they are pulling off the panels in the Della Robbia tradition. That's just something that makes Larry really almost a keeper of knowledge older than his own years, because he's interested in the persistence of great ideas about making things from classical and Renaissance sources that are alive and well in the great machine age. When this building was built, these panels are coming out of a mechanized terracotta works, but they're being made in the manner and even the appearance of a 13th or 14th century handmade panel from Renaissance Italy. And Larry finds great hope that humanity can pass down these kinds of traditions and that they persist despite changes in technology. That these kinds of ways of doing things uplift us all. I love this image because it shows that act of peeling back the layers, and those are those aviation hammers I talked about in the foreground. But I love the depth of the city, and the question here is, where does the work end? Is it peeling back the brick to get to that terracotta? Or will Larry and his crews soon be working across the street on the next building, the one after that? How much of the city will end up filling the warehouse? Something that the Giles Project and the NBAC, created largest American storage problem, but Larry actually did succeed in getting some of the material returned to the city, not just the small stuff put into living rooms in the Soulard Lafayette Square neighborhoods, but sometimes big works like the St. Louis Title Company facade that Landmarks Association funded his removal. They delivered to the City Museum. And at Wright, the Hanley Junior High School murals that Larry was able to remove at the behest of preservationists in University City. They're being here in 2000 installed at Shaarei Emeth, the synagogue in Creve Coeur. These are examples of Larry seeing his operation as not simply hoarding and grabbing more, but also returning this out into the world. And this is a function of the NBAC that could be explored further. It's not just architecture, it's cultural heritage. Here's this Flounder House in Soulard that was the headquarters of Hlas, or the Voice in Czech language. This is a Czech nationalist publication that reached around the world, founded by Hynek Dostal in St. Louis in 1872. This is a publication that helps launch the successful Czech independence movement. And Tomáš Masaryk, the first president of Czechoslovakia in 1918, even visited this building probably one or two times. Larry was interested in recovering the doorway, not simply as an example of a good Greek revival wooden carpentry entrance, very, very nice example, but also because that doorknob would have been touched potentially by Masaryk and other people who made the modern Czech world. And so throughout the 80s and 90s, it's scenes like this, harvesting the mass material of clay roofing tile, are going after the finer and delicate terracotta pieces. But it is more. The warehouses are overflowing. And in 1997, Larry pulls off his largest architectural salvage project at the Ambassador Theater in 7th and Locust in downtown, recovering the entire cornice and all the figurative relief panels in the base. And here's the cornice removal work, the numbers resurrecting the ways in which they were laid. He found the drawings from the Winkle Terracotta Company, the University of Minnesota archive. Each piece numbered. They returned these number systems, brought everything to the roof for cleaning the mortar and backing brick, getting each piece spotless, stripping off that horrible yellow paint that had been applied to the base of the building, creating it, lowering it down, taking it off to Larry's warehouses. There's Larry at the left supervising this work. Now, the cornice is 125 feet by 150 feet, and a lot of people, including great museums like the Met, would be happy to have a 10-foot run because those are repeated motifs. The garlands and cartouches and the sphinxes just repeat over and over again. You don't need all of that, but in Larry's mind, you did. And he showed so much care to that building and others that it's pretty dazzling. Here's a burned out church on the north side on the 1900 block of St. Louis Avenue, St. Paul's Methodist Episcopal. Um, it's one of many churches, but he's carefully removing the cornerstone. And just look at that formwork there. Here's stone meets terracotta. Those columns in that arcade are of terracotta, and he's built this simple wooden form here to hold it up while it's being removed. Often those forms would have been made by master carpenter Mike Waldo, one of Larry's collaborators. But those lumber pieces anybody could get, and Larry thought the simplicity of what he was doing was replicable and always wondered why more people didn't do it. He's like, I'm getting lumber from the hardware store and using trucks that anybody can find. Often the cost of what he was doing was so low. Far wealthier people could buy better tools, better trucks, hire more people, do this work even more quickly and with better results, and it never happened. So the MBAC collections are infused with Larry's sort of capacious vision of what should be collected. For instance, projects like this recovery leading to mounds of ornamental brick. Today, there are almost 25,000 ornamental bricks in the NBAC collections, sorted, inventoried, and there's still not every pattern sold by St. Louis's Hydraulic Press Brick Company. I don't know how that's even possible. We still would need more to have comprehensive. Cast iron storefronts, the sort of genesis of the modern building type, the kind of cast iron what Bob talked about in Siegfried Gideon's appreciative gaze. 204 complete sets, 6 partial. And I think Larry sometimes bought the foundry over in SAH so he could spread out these storefronts to finally inventory them. Larry's last major work was the demolition of the Century Building in 2004. He recovered that entire Roman victory arch that led into the theater. You can see him there in the top right working alone on that removal. He also got significant cast iron spandrels, not just the spandrels that have been applied in 1906, but the older Winslow Brothers of Chicago pieces beneath them. Many of the decorative elements, some raw marble from the wreckers, and then an example of every type of structural piece in this building. This is built 5 years after the Wainwright building, designed by Rader, Coffin, and Crocker, and it is a throwback. It's an Italian palazzo made out of Georgian marble in the era of the modern skyscraper with the curtain wall. So these are actually bearing masonry walls, and a weird construction that involved both steel and cast iron, augmented by later steel added when the vaudeville movie theater or vaudeville theater inside was converted into department store space. Larry thought the construction methods were so strange. Some curious person will want to see physical examples of every base plate, every column, and every girder. That's the kind of encyclopedic vision that Larry had, and the concern that obscure knowledge often is the most revelatory. But Larry was slowing down and going after whole buildings because his collecting of archival objects had soared, and his collection of non-building pieces, but built environment related, like these 2 items, chimney pot from the architectural or decorative chimney pot from New York Architectural Terracotta, one of the many sort of small makers items that were given to salespeople and customers that Larry collected. At Wright, the Pioneer Company, these enamel mid-century modern panels, these are a product sample kit for a salesman. So much of this kind of material filling archival boxes along with photographs, trade and product catalogs, rare periodicals, and other items of ephemera. Larry knows he needs a big home for all of this, and things start to become institutionalized. And this is kind of where I'm going to start to end this talk on the recent past. The first effort is in 2002 to start the Building Arts Foundation, St. Louis Building Arts Foundation. 2 years later, a panel led by scholars like Kara McCarty, Eric Sandweiss, Joseph Heathcott, and developer Steve Trampy recommends a new museum on the East St. Louis riverfront. That leads to the purchase of the sterling steel site in 2005. But eventually, Larry decides that the new museum is too expensive, too slow. He's been waiting 20 years for this museum already. He's just going to build it in SAH because he can tackle this kind of work himself, often alone or with helpers. Let's just get this done. That's the kind of spirit that I think has really made this a unique project. Is we're not waiting for to look like the Met. We're just gonna get things going. I mean, Larry didn't wait to be trained or funded to go out and rescue the collection. He just made all of this happen. So 2007, the Brooklyn Museum begins deaccessioning the Anonymous Arts Recovery Society materials, and the first public events begin at SAGE to show off this place. And if you were over there then, you probably remember the weedy grounds, the buildings in states of disrepair, and the artifacts kind of packed willy-nilly. It's much more organized and much more polished today. It's been 18 years of work over there, 19 years actually. In 2012, Larry and I kick around different names to honor the new flows of materials from Brooklyn and the size of the library, and we come up with the name National Building Arts Center. Rename the whole project and recast the vision of this, not just as something telling St. Louis about itself, but now the entire nation, being strongly rooted in the region, but really honoring this is the largest repository of such information in the country. And in 2019, the library is finished and opened. And here's some aerial views just showing the site on 13 and a half acres with 13 buildings in various states of renovation. Only the 1950s office building library is finished. Artifacts everywhere. The stone yard at left, the century building arch is in the top of that photo. The right, and at right is that Lindell building that Larry got all the terracotta off of, still sitting in those wire baskets he loaded back in the 80s. A question for a lot of years, what is a museum? And is this one? The International Council of Museums definition here says that a museum has to be a nonprofit permanent institution in the service of society, does certain things around artifacts, that includes conservation, interpretation, and exhibition, must be open to the public, accessible, and inclusive. It must operate and communicate ethically and professionally with the participation of communities, et cetera, et cetera. You can read it. Did Larry make this happen in his lifetime? Well, I think he did. And I think that the National Building Arts Center today undoubtedly is a museum and meets all these standards. Unfortunately, Larry's not with us to see the contemporary period, although he is the man whose shoulders allowed any of this work to be contemplated, let alone be built on. Larry died 3 years ago in the summer of 2021 due to complications of leukemia at the age of 73. It was quite a shock, and it propelled the four of us who were left on the board of directors to think about not only what we wanted to see happen to realize Larry's vision, but the level of personal responsibility we wanted to take. After all, we wanted to see this go through. We would have to do what Larry did. Maybe. And nobody could do any of that all the way. And nobody could do what Larry did, living there as the chief architect, engineer, builder, curator, director, night watchman. I mean, he was the museum itself. So how do you replace that? Well, that's when you start to look at these other institutions and make the NBAC much more sustainable by building it sort of unorthodox ways into a more traditional structure, but not too traditional. Major goals that we decided in 2021 to expand visibility and outreach, to provide access to the library and collections, to partner with other organizations for exhibition and education, to launch public programs, to professionalize with paid staff, to expand the board of directors, and to diversify funding sources. All these things have happened in 3 abrupt years. It just seems like yesterday when we lost dear Larry. But now we've already had 3 of our annual lecture series. There's Kelly Murphy in one of our recent ones. Can you believe that we've come that far so fast? We started with a paid staff member with Emory back in 2021. We now have regular access programs, an expanded and active board of directors at the National Building Arts Center, and more material. The Statue of Liberty replica, dubbed Little Liberty, is going to rise on that pedestal in the background. That was one of Larry's last major projects that we decided had to be seen through The statue has arrived. It will rise in the next year or so. There's a lot of complications with any of this when you're a small institution, but even if not, steel fabrication is a different ballpark than it was when the pandemic started. Nonetheless, despite the lack of sort of formal displays, 1,500 people came through the NBAC last year. I'll be curious to see this year's figure. That's over double what happened in 2022. And they're coming like these two retired chimney sweeps, right? Just to look at the artifacts. They're coming on the regular monthly tours. They're coming like the students from the Washington University, the right to use the library and archive. Many reasons are bringing people through here. So yes, um, this does seem to be a museum. The lecture series, here's Jana Añanueva Langholz lecturing about the Philippine village and its ties to the timber industry in 2023. Look at those full chairs out in that casting shed. No museum is like this. The building site of construction, archive of artifacts, conservation work, storage of vehicles. It's all around the seats here. So you're literally in the thick of it, not in some formal lecture hall. Now you are out in the summer heat. That is something that could change a little. But in the library, we have climate control, we have research work occurring, we have active efforts to catalog the library. Here's Emma Mormon, intern, who worked on cataloging everything. Go to our website. You can find that catalog where only 1,934 items are inventoried out of hundreds of thousands, if not, who knows? I don't want to use the word million, but it could be close in the end. More efforts are needed to ramp up this inventory, to accession everything into a formal database that's publicly accessible. But the fruits so far are visible, and Emery, Cox, and other volunteers are working on finding aids for the different collections that are populating the library, from the Mesker Brothers Sheet Metal Company to Becker and Taxis Engineers to the interior design of hotel architect William Sidney Wagner. Finding your way through all those collections before you visit will help you decide whether or not a trip to St. Louis is worth it. If you're in St. Louis, you shouldn't hesitate, though. Just come through the door, make an appointment, start looking around, become familiar. All of you watching this talk probably do some form of research around the built environment. And the accessions continue to roll in. I'm serving now on the collections committee along with Emery and Eric Sandweiss. And here's some recent items. The Inland Architect, who's going to say no to that, coming from this great period of transition from modernism to postmodernism in Chicago. And at Wright, part of the Dana Thomas House plaster work with a Frank Lloyd Wright design pattern. Of course, we want Frank Lloyd Wright in the collection, but we're sorting through these kinds of collections issues daily and continuing to have the chicken and the egg question. Do we take more as we're waiting that day when we become a museum? But Larry left us with this mission where we do take more. We are the nation's repository, whether we are putting it up on display immediately or not. Most museums don't display even half of what they hold, right? Everything's in deep storage. But there are ways to make things come to life virtually. Photogrammetry. Alan Yang worked with the columns on the Clemens House and built a 3D model based on actual photogrammetry. You can virtually move the columns around, look inside of them. This will someday allow us to go building by building and resurrect the lost buildings virtually and show where our artifacts would have been located. That's a big detriment from our open storage tours. Even with a great photograph, sometimes people can't think it through. Here, you can highlight one of the columns, pull it virtually off the building, look through it, look at its patina, look at its form, look at its details. Alan and I will be giving a webinar on November 13th to talk about this in length. So if you're interested, check that out. And of course, our exhibition last year at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation. This is a great kinship, even though the Pulitzer space is more of an austere white box designed by Tadao Ando. Emily Pulitzer, like Larry Giles, was this larger than life force who had this vision for what a museum could be that filled a need. There was no museum like the Pulitzer yet, displaying contemporary art in a manner that Emily Pulitzer believed benefited the dignity of ordinary people. Larry Giles also interested in the dignity of ordinary people through his collecting of a wider swath of the built environment that touched the hands of laborers and workers. So, to Emily Pulitzer, you could walk into the Pulitzer galleries and look at the art without the mediation of experts. So there's no didactics. There are gallery guides and curatorial texts, but they're in pockets. You can seek them if you wish, or you can walk through and let your own visual intelligence guide the way. And here in the Rivoli, in the Cube Gallery, you have a great example of that. These sgraffito panels on display upright for the first time since they came off the building in 1983, removed from one of Larry's crates, which was brought into the gallery. You can take this all in, or you can go to the ephemera case and read up more of what happened here. But it's self-evident the beauty and complexity of these pieces, as well as the crate, which suggests the kind of liminal nature of Larry's collecting. He had no idea when these objects were going to be uncreated. That it would take 40 years probably wouldn't have surprised him. They're back in the crate now. When will they appear again? We don't know that. The crate symbolizes this kind of long-term faith in the value of these artifacts. And the Pulitzer's way of presenting things has given us ideas for what can happen at NBAC. The lack of panels means, how do you show people how fragile and hand-pressed terracotta is? Well, you just make a triptych here out of these pieces from the Mission Free School, turn one around. It speaks for itself. People are smart. They don't often need the pokes and prods. Sometimes it's access that's missing, or emphasis. So this is a great exhibition, and we don't have time to get into detail. It's great to bring the Rusty Clemens columns in dialogue with Sarah's Joe, for instance, to fill a traditional museum space, to tell stories about St. Louis, not simply about the material, but how do the material forms evoke social, political, economic, racial, gender histories? How do all those histories make people feel more included and more a part of St. Louis? That's something the NBAC is going to have to do, not just for St. Louis, but for the other cities it interprets when it's up and running. And I think we had a very successful run in 2023 at the Pulitzer. We're able to tell some of these stories and unleash the artifacts. It's just so fun to watch these pieces finally live in a museum form, and some of Larry's intentions, which go back over 4 decades, finally be realized. And this was one of the Pulitzer's most popular exhibitions. Over 9,900 people came through. So someday, hopefully, that's the attendance figure at the NBAC in SAH, and hopefully that gets blown away quickly by another number, bigger, and then some, until the whole nation has been through the doors, and until the whole nation comes through and learns those lessons. Now, one item in the Pulitzer display case ties back to the whole origin story of Larry as a salvager, and that's this sheet from the 1973 interim comprehensive plan by the City Planning Commission of St. Louis. This argument here of dividing the city up into a triage system, treating only the best areas and letting the worst go through neglect, became controversial when articulated by the planning firm Team 4 2 years later. It shows one way of looking at the kind of problems of older American cities, one that is about managing risk, one that looks from the God's eye view down rather than from the sidewalk out. It's one that misses all the social and architectural detail that captivated Larry Giles. It's the way of thinking that Larry's project, becoming the NBAC, stands against, sometimes quietly, not always very polemic, just doing what needs to be done to combat this consciousness by reminding people of how much memory and value there is in a simple brick, terracotta, or cast iron storefront. That's the kind of legacy of the NBAC. How do you unpack the ordinary world's ordinary built environment in ways that make it extraordinary and unleash the power that can be found in almost every pocket of America? What we can see in the NBAC artifacts can be seen in historic neighborhoods everywhere. So how does a visit here send you back out with greater appreciation and make you the kind of citizen who will stand against the carelessness that has destroyed so much of our historic built environment in the face of the crises we see in the United States today? And how does this phrase built environment open up a wider possible audience than just the word architecture with its sort of elite and rare overtones. No knock on that word, but the built environment is a system with many inputs. Architecture is one, alongside landscape architecture, engineering, material fabrication, geology, finance, um, politics, urban planning, all forms of inhabiting the built environment add layers of meaning. Everyone who interacts with built space becomes one of its stewards. So, short of being a museum that widens things so wide that it collects everything and tells everything, what does it mean for the National Building Arts Center to be a museum for our age? Well, I'm not so sure there is a problem with connecting the built environment, the smallest artifact, the most obscure detail most people just walk past without noticing, to these gigantic stories of what it means to be a human and what are our priorities and values as an American society. And I think that the NBAC is uniquely suited to do that. I think it's already doing that, but I do think, again, that its bigger days still lie ahead. The NBAC has so much potential. We've just begun to map that potential. And in the coming years, I think we're going to see that potential realized, not just in St. Louis, but across the nation. I think this will be one of the enduring new museums in the 21st century. So I thank you for your attention. And since I'm in West Virginia, not St. Louis anymore, please keep in touch. Here's some ways you can keep in touch with me. And I look forward to any dialogue. Please reach out if this lecture provoked a question or a thought. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you to the Society of Architectural Historians, the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Library, for making this possible.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. We invite you to please join us for a third and final lecture for fall 2024. John C. Gunther, FAIA Lead AP, will be giving a talk entitled The Forgotten Architectural Legacy of Harvey Ellis. The talk will take place November 19, 2024 from 6:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. We'll be here at Central Library in the auditorium. Thank you and good night.